The Dallas County Courthouse hummed with its usual morning activity when Officer Karen Mitchell burst through the doors of Courtroom 4B. Her boots struck the marble floor with military precision as she marched forward, roughly guiding a handcuffed man before her. 15 years on the force had taught her to trust her instincts, and this suspect had triggered every red flag during her morning patrol. "Your Honor," she announced, her voice carrying that familiar edge of authority. Bringing in another troublemaker. Resisting, arrest and suspicious behavior. Her fingers dug unnecessarily into the man's arm, a habit born from years of treating every suspect as a threat. The prisoner stood quietly, his dignity unbowed despite the circumstances. A dusty cowboy hat was pulled low over his eyes, his beard peppered with gray. His clothes were simple, worn jeans, a faded denim shirt, scuffed leather boots. Just another aging troublemaker, she'd thought during the arrest. But something was wrong. The gallery, typically indifferent to routine bookings, erupted in shocked whispers. Judge Martinez's hand, reaching for his gavel, froze mid-air. His eyes widened, then narrowed, fixing Mitchell with a look she'd never seen before. Exchanged meaningful glances, a young clerk dropped his pen, the metallic clatter against the floor startlingly loud in the charged atmosphere. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keys as she stared at the suspect. Mitchell felt her certainty waver. The air in the courtroom seemed to thicken with tension. She turned to look at her prisoner properly for the first time since the arrest, and as she did, he slowly raised his head, the hat tilted back, revealing his face in the harsh fluorescent light. Behind that trademark beard were eyes she'd seen 1,000 times, on television, in movies, on posters, in the police gym. Eyes that had watched over Texas like a guardian. For decades, Chuck Norris, martial arts legend, television icon, and honorary Texas Ranger stood before her in handcuffs. The man who had trained countless police officers in self-defense, who had dedicated his life to helping troubled youth, who commanded respect across the state. And she had treated him like a common criminal. The color drained from Mitchell's face as the magnitude of her mistake crashed over her. Her fingers loosened their grip on his arm. Her hand fell limply to her side. In the gallery, phones emerged, capturing the moment that would undoubtedly end her career. She hadn't just made an arrest. She had assaulted a legend. And now the whole world would know. The truck had pulled over smoothly, professionally. The driver remained still, hands visible on the steering wheel. Mitchell approached, hand resting on her weapon. "License and registration," she barked, studying the man's reflection in the side mirror. There was something familiar about him, something that made her uneasy. "Yes, ma'am," the man replied calmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that only irritated her more. 2 hours earlier, the Texas morning sun cast long shadows across Highway 121. Officer Karen Mitchell sat in her patrol car, scanning traffic with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 15 years looking for trouble. When the old pickup truck passed her position, something about it raised her hackles. The driver's calm demeanor seemed too deliberate, too controlled. She pulled out behind the truck, lights flashing. The vehicle responded perfectly, pulling over with professional precision. Too perfect, she thought. Must be hiding something. Mitchell approached the driver's side, hand resting on her weapon. The man inside sat motionless, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. His cowboy hat cast shadows across his face, but she caught a glimpse of a gray beard and weathered features. "License and registration," she barked, studying his reflection in the side mirror. The man's composure irritated her. Most people showed at least a hint of nervousness around law enforcement. "Yes, ma'am," he replied calmly, his voice carrying an authority that set her teeth on edge. He moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for the glove compartment. Mitchell's hand tightened on her weapon. "Faster!" she snapped. "What's taking so long?" "Just being careful, officer," he responded, maintaining that infuriating calm. "Don't want any misunderstandings." That was it. His composed demeanor felt like a challenge to her authority. When he finally produced the documents, she barely glanced at them. She ordered, "Out." "Is there a problem?" he asked, still maddeningly polite. "Now." Her voice cracked like a whip. The man complied, moving with a fluid grace that only heightened her suspicion. Before he could fully straighten, she had him against the truck, arms behind his back. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly, not resisting but not cowering either. "Shut it," she snapped, roughly cuffing him. "We've got reports of suspicious activity in the area." She was so focused on asserting her dominance that she missed the signs, the gathering crowd with their phones raised, the shocked whispers, the way other drivers slowed, staring in disbelief. She didn't notice the martial arts dojo sticker on the truck's bumper, the Walker, Texas Ranger crew pass hanging from the rearview mirror. Officer Karen Mitchell was about to learn the hardest lesson of her career. She had just arrested Chuck Norris. Judge Martinez cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the charged atmosphere of Courtroom 4B. "Officer Mitchell," he began, his voice unnaturally controlled. "Would you please read the charges?" Mitchell straightened, pulling out her notepad with practiced efficiency. "Suspicious behavior. Resisting arrest and failure to comply with an officer's orders, Your Honor." She allowed herself a small smile, certain of her position and the defendant's name. The judge pressed his lips together, his expression unreadable. Mitchell faltered slightly, realizing she hadn't properly checked the license she'd confiscated. Glancing down at the paperwork in her hand, she read the name for the first time. The letters seemed to blur before her eyes. Carlos Ray, Chuck Norris. Her head snapped up, really looking at her prisoner for the first time. The hat no longer shadowed his face, and there was no mistaking those features, ones she'd grown up seeing on television, in movies, on posters, even in her martial arts classes as a kid. The gallery's whispers grew louder. A reporter from the Dallas Morning News was already scribbling furiously in his notebook. The bailiff, a 20-year veteran himself, stood rigid, his expression a mixture of shock and disapproval, directed not at the prisoner, but at her. "Mr. Norris," Judge Martinez addressed him directly, his tone completely transformed. "I must apologize for this situation. Would you like to press charges?" Chuck Norris straightened, his presence suddenly filling the room despite the handcuffs. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of earned respect. "No, Your Honor. But I would like to say something." The judge nodded, and every eye in the courtroom fixed on the martial arts legend. Mitchell felt her world shrank, certainty crumbling with each passing second. "I've spent my life teaching that true strength isn't about domination," Norris said, his eyes meeting Mitchell's. "It's about protection, about serving others. I've trained countless law enforcement officers, taught them that authority comes from wisdom, not force." His words struck Mitchell like physical blows. She remembered now, the poster in her academy classroom, his quote about power and responsibility. She had once sworn by those words. Years of cynicism had hardened her. "Remove those handcuffs," Judge Martinez ordered, his voice sharp. Mitchell fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling slightly. Chuck Norris remained perfectly still. The moment the cuffs fell away, he rolled his shoulders once and turned to face her fully. "Officer Mitchell," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." The tension in Courtroom 4B could be cut with a knife. Mitchell stood frozen, her face a mask of growing horror as Chuck Norris faced her. The legend before her wasn't displaying the deadly skills that had made him famous. No roundhouse kicks, no martial arts moves. Instead, his quiet dignity made her feel smaller than any physical confrontation could have. "Your Honor," Norris addressed the judge while keeping his eyes on Mitchell. May I have a moment to share something with the officer? Judge Martinez nodded, curiosity evident in his expression. The gallery leaned forward, phones still recording, eager to capture whatever was about to unfold. Officer Mitchell, Norris began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. Do you know what the hardest technique I ever had to master was? Mitchell swallowed hard, her throat dry. She'd watched his movies, seen his fights. The roundhouse kick, she ventured weakly. A small smile played at the corners of his beard. No, Mom. It was learning when not to fight. He took a step, closer. And despite her training, Mitchell had to resist the urge to step back. The greatest power isn't in knowing how to. Them have had run-ins with the law, he said, his tone calm but firm. But here, they're not criminals. They're students learning discipline, respect, and control. Mitchell swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. Take someone down? That's easy, Norris had said in the courtroom. Real strength is knowing when to help them up. That truth hit her harder than any physical blow. She thought of how quickly she had escalated the traffic stop, how eager she had been to assert her dominance. I've trained thousands of law enforcement officers, Norris continued, and the first thing I teach them is that a badge, like a black belt, isn't a weapon. It's a responsibility. When you wear either one, you're not above the law or others. You're meant to protect, to serve, to lift people up. Mitchell's eyes burned with unshed tears. She remembered why she had joined the force. To help people. When had that changed? When had she started seeing threats instead of citizens? Your Honor, Norris turned to the judge. I don't want to press charges. Instead, I'd like to offer Officer Mitchell an opportunity. The courtroom held its breath. Mitchell felt her future hanging by a thread. 1 week, Norris said. 1 week at my ranch, training with me and my students, learning what real strength looks like. He turned back to her. That is, if you're willing to learn. The silence was deafening. Mitchell looked at the man she had wrongfully arrested, this legend who was offering redemption instead of retribution, and found her voice. Yes, sir, she whispered. I'm willing to learn. Gravel crunched under Mitchell's boots as she pulled up to Lone Wolf Ranch, Chuck Norris's legendary training facility outside Dallas. Her police uniform felt out of place here, like armor she couldn't hide behind anymore. The morning sun cast long shadows across the practice yards where groups of students, children, teenagers, and adults moved through martial arts forms with fluid grace. Chuck Norris stood on the front porch wearing a simple black tie, watching her approach. No uniform, no badge, no visible symbols of authority, yet his presence commanded more respect than any police chief she had ever met. Welcome to my world, he said as she reached the steps. First rule, leave your badge in the car. Mitchell hesitated. Sir, Here, you're not Officer Mitchell, he interrupted gently. You're just Karen, a student like everyone else. Inside the main building, Mitchell found herself in a different kind of briefing room. Instead of tactical maps and crime statistics, the walls held philosophical quotes and principles of martial arts. A group of teenagers practiced in the corner, including some she recognized from her past arrests. Surprised, she turned to Norris. He noted her expression and nodded. Many of them have had run-ins with the law, he said, but here they're not criminals, they're students. The stronger one. Years of police work had conditioned her to react with force, to dominate a situation before it escalated. But here, things were different. Marcus stood ready, waiting. There was no fear in his stance, only focus. She clenched her fists, then took a slow breath. Instead of striking, she feinted, a test. Marcus didn't flinch. Commit to your actions, but control them, Chuck advised, watching closely. Mitchell threw a slow, measured punch. Marcus sidestepped, using the movement Chuck had demonstrated the day before. Fluid, non-aggressive, redirecting rather than meeting force with force. Again, Chuck instructed. They repeated the drill, each time Mitchell adjusting her approach. Marcus responded with discipline, not defiance. For the first time she saw him not as a suspect, but as a student, just like her. The morning passed in a rhythm of training, reflection, and unspoken understanding. When Chuck finally called a break, Mitchell found herself sitting beside Marcus, on the edge of the mat. "You're different from when you arrested me," he said, not accusing, just observing. She exhaled. "I'm trying to be." He nodded, as if that was enough. From across the dojo, Chuck watched, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The lesson wasn't just about technique, it was about something deeper. Learning when to fight, when to step back, and most importantly, when to lift someone up instead of knocking them down. Mitchell felt the weight of Sarah's gaze as they faced each other on the mat. The tension between them was undeniable. Sarah's stance was defensive but steady, her expression unreadable. Mitchell knew this wasn't just another training exercise. For Sarah, it was personal. "Begin," Chuck instructed. Sarah moved first, testing Mitchell's reactions. She was fast, calculated, not attacking outright, but feeling for an opening. Mitchell matched her movements, but she hesitated, realizing she wasn't just up against skill. She was up against resentment, against the consequences of her past actions. "Come on," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "You didn't hesitate back then." The words hit harder than any strike. Mitchell swallowed the lump in her throat. Back then, she hadn't seen a frightened daughter watching as her father was taken away, only a suspect resisting arrest. She took a deep breath and adjusted her stance. "I was wrong," she admitted. Sarah froze, clearly not expecting the words. "I was doing my job," Mitchell continued, "but I didn't see you. I should have." The room was silent, all eyes on them. Sarah's shoulders relaxed, slightly. Instead of striking, she stepped back, bowing her head just a fraction before resuming her stance. Chuck smiled. Lesson learned. Mitchell understood now. This was never about who was stronger. It was about breaking cycles, about learning when to fight and when to listen. For the first time in years, she wasn't just enforcing the law, she was learning how to truly serve. Student, a teenager who had trusted her to follow the exercise. The dojo was silent, all eyes on her, but Mitchell barely noticed. She was too focused on Sarah, on the tears brimming in the girl's eyes. Mitchell started, but no words came. Chuck exhaled slowly. "Karen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "step outside." Mitchell hesitated, then turned and walked out onto the porch. The cool air did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She had come here to learn, but all she had done was prove why she needed to be here in the first place. A moment later, Chuck joined her. He leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "Tell me what just happened in there." Mitchell stared at the ground. I reacted. Chuck nodded. "And why?" She swallowed hard. "Because I felt threatened." "Were you?" Mitchell hesitated, then shook her head. "No." Chuck studied her for a long moment. "You see the problem, don't you?" She let out a shaky breath. "I treated her like a suspect, not a person." Chuck nodded. "You're trained to control, to dominate. But fear makes us overreach. It makes us see threats where there aren't any." He let the words sink in before adding, "You weren't just reacting to Sarah. You were reacting to your own past." Mitchell clenched her jaw. "I don't know how to fix that." Chuck turned toward the dojo, where students had resumed their training. "Then it's a good thing you're here to learn her past arrests." They filed in hesitantly, some defiant, others uncertain, all carrying the same wary energy Mitchell had once mistaken for hostility. Chuck greeted them with the same calm authority he showed everyone. No judgment, no condescension, just respect. "Welcome," he said. "You're here to learn, just like everyone else." Mitchell caught sight of Marcus and Sarah among the students, blending in seamlessly with the newcomers. A younger boy lingered at the edge of the group, arms crossed, his posture rigid with distrust. She recognized him instantly. Jamal, a kid she detained multiple times for shoplifting. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Hey, Jamal." His eyes flicked to her, wary. "You a cop here too?" Mitchell shook her head. "No badge. Here. Just Karen." Jamal studied her for a long moment before nodding slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Chuck clapped his hands together. "All right, let's begin." Mitchell knew now that this training wasn't just about learning how to fight. It was about unlearning, about breaking old patterns and seeing people for who they were, not just what they had done. And for the first time in years, she felt like she was finally becoming the officer she had always meant to be, a cop. The kids stared, curiosity overtaking their initial hesitation. Even Tommy peeked out from behind the others. "I thought if I was tough enough, if I controlled every situation, I could stop what happened to my brother from happening to anyone else," Mitchell continued. "But I was wrong." She turned to Chuck, who handed her a wooden training staff. "Balance isn't about control," he said. "It's about knowing when to push and when to yield." Mitchell took a stance as Chuck instructed. One by one, students approached, testing her balance as she adjusted, not resisting, not overpowering, just moving with their energy. When Tommy hesitantly stepped forward, she met his gaze. "Go ahead," she encouraged. He nudged the staff, lightly at first, then with more confidence. Mitchell shifted smoothly, keeping her footing without forcing her strength onto him. For the first time, Tommy wasn't looking at her with fear. When the exercise ended, he lingered. "Your tattoo," he finally said. "What was his name?" "David," she answered softly. Tommy nodded as if committing it to memory before walking back to the group. Chuck's voice carried through the yard. "Strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up and helping others do the same." For the first time in years, Mitchell felt like she was finally standing on solid ground. "Can save us a better way now." The words hit Mitchell harder than she expected. She had spent years enforcing the law with authority, but here was a kid showing her a different kind of leadership, one built on trust instead of fear. She crouched to meet Tommy's eyes. "I'm going to try," she promised. Tommy gave a small nod, then glanced at Chuck, who was watching with quiet approval. "Think I can come back here?" Tommy asked. Chuck smiled. "Doors are always open for those willing to learn." Mitchell watched as Tommy jogged back to the group, something lighter in his steps. As the van pulled away, she turned to Chuck. "That felt different," she admitted. "Because it was," he said simply. "You didn't just teach them, you connected with them." Mitchell exhaled, feeling the weight she'd carried for years start to lift. She had come here thinking she needed to learn how to fight differently. Instead, she was learning how to be different. Could teach us the right way now. Mitchell felt something shift inside her, the last piece of her old self falling away, making room for something new. She looked at Chuck, who watched from the porch with a knowing smile. "I'd like that, Tommy," she said. "I'd like that a lot." That evening, Mitchell found herself alone in the ranch's meditation garden. The day's events with Tommy had stirred something deep inside her, bringing memories of her brother to the surface. She sat on a wooden bench, her GI still damp from training, watching the Texas stars emerge. The sound of boots on gravel announced Chuck's approach. He carried 2 steaming mugs of coffee, offering one to her without a word. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, the cricket chorus their only company. "You're troubled," Chuck finally said. It wasn't a question. Mitchell stared into her coffee. I keep thinking about why I became a cop after my brother. She paused, gathering herself. I wanted to be the barrier between good kids and bad choices. Somewhere along the way, I became the threat instead of the protection. Chuck nodded. Slowly. Fear is a powerful teacher, he said, but it only teaches more fear. How do you do it? She asked. These kids come to you angry, scared, just like I was after losing Michael. But you don't try to force them to change. Because change can't be forced, Chuck replied. It could only be guided. He set his mug down. Watch this. He picked up a fallen leaf and held it over the garden's small pond. If I force this leaf underwater, he demonstrated, pushing it down, it fights to rise. The moment I release it, it returns to the surface unchanged. He lifted the leaf, then gently placed it on the water's surface. But if I show it a new way to rest, the leaf floated peacefully. Mitchell understood. Like Tommy today with the skateboarding analogy, he taught me as much as I taught him. That's the secret, Chuck smiled. True teaching flows both ways. Your brother's death made you want to protect others. That's honorable, but protection doesn't always look like we expect it to. Mitchell pulled out her badge, studying it in the fading light. The metal caught the sunset, reflecting gold instead of its usual stark silver. I've been wearing this all wrong, she said softly. No, Chuck corrected. You've been carrying it all wrong. A badge, like a black belt, isn't meant to be a burden. It's a reminder of responsibility. Mitchell felt tears form, but for the first time in years, they weren't bitter. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing past my mistakes. Chuck stood, collecting their mugs. The week's almost over, he said, but something tells me your real training is just beginning. Mitchell remained in the garden long after he left, watching the stars multiply overhead, feeling more at peace than she had since losing her brother. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she had finally found her balance. Mitchell's first day back on patrol felt different. Her uniform, once a shield of authority, now rested lighter on her shoulders. The weight of her badge spoke not of power, but of responsibility. As she cruised through her familiar beat, the city streets stepped forward, her posture calm but assured. The crowd parted slightly, wary but curious. Kevin's fists were clenched, his stance rigid with anger. His opponent, a taller boy, sneered, waiting for the inevitable clash. A year ago, Mitchell would have barked orders, demanded compliance, and forced them apart. Today she met Kevin's eyes and simply said, "Looks like you forgot something from the ranch." Kevin hesitated, his breath heavy. "He disrespected my brother," he muttered, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Mitchell nodded. "And what did Chuck teach you about strength?" The taller boy scoffed. "Man, forget that. She's just here to throw you in cuffs." Mitchell ignored him, keeping her focus on Kevin. "You know better. Power isn't about proving you're stronger. It's about knowing when to walk away." The words hung in the air. Kevin's jaw tightened. Then he exhaled slowly. His hands relaxed. His stance loosened. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The tension broke. The crowd murmured, disappointed by the lack of a fight, but within moments they began to disperse. The taller boy laughed. "Yeah, keep running, coward." Mitchell took a step closer. "And you, what are you proving?" He faltered, shoving his hands into his pockets. With nothing left to fuel the moment, he slunk off toward the school doors. Mitchell watched Kevin disappear down the street, a quiet sense of pride settling in. She could have arrested him. She could have escalated things. Instead, she had done something far more difficult, trusted him to make the right choice. As she walked back to her car, the radio crackled again, another call waiting. But this time, she knew she wasn't just enforcing the law. She was guiding. "Someone," called out, voices tinged with apprehension. Instead of charging in, she walked calmly toward them, hands visible, stance relaxed but ready, exactly as Chuck had taught her. "Kevin," she said softly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet lot. "Show me what you learned at the ranch." The boy's eyes widened with recognition. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his fists and stepped back. His opponent, confused by this unexpected turn, looked between them with uncertainty. "Sometimes, the strongest move is stepping away," Mitchell announced. Her words reached every ear in the crowd. "How about we all practice that right now?" The gathering dispersed, not from fear but from understanding. Kevin's would-be opponent shuffled away, the tension fading without a single threat or show of force. Mitchell caught her reflection. In a nearby window, not a warrior but a guardian, not an enforcer but a protector. "Thanks," Kevin muttered, scuffing his shoe against the asphalt. "I almost forgot what Sensei Chuck taught us." Mitchell smiled, recalling her own lessons. "We're all still learning, Kevin, every single day." 6 months after her transformation at the ranch, Mitchell pulled up to Chuck's familiar gravel driveway. This time, she wasn't alone. In her passenger seat sat Jason Torres, the 16-year-old she had caught breaking into cars. Instead of reaching for handcuffs, she had reached out with an offer, the same one Chuck had once given her. "You sure about this?" Jason asked, eyeing the practice yard where students moved through their forms. "As sure as Chuck was about me," Mitchell replied, leading him toward the porch where her mentor waited. Chuck's eyes crinkled with approval above his beard. "Welcome back, Karen. I see you brought a new student." "Learning to guide instead of arrest," she said, "just like you taught me." A year to the day after that fateful traffic stop, Mitchell stood before a mixed group of police cadets and troubled teens at the ranch. The old barriers between law enforcement and the community had dissolved in this sacred space. She watched Chuck demonstrate a technique, remembering how her own journey had begun with resistance and ended in revelation. True strength, she told her audience, isn't about how much power you have, it's about how you choose to use it. Every interaction is a chance to lift someone up instead of tearing them down. In the back row, Jason Torres sat beside a rookie officer, both students now, both learning the same lessons about respect, responsibility, and redemption. Chuck met Mitchell's gaze and nodded, his silent approval washing over her like the Texas sunset. The mistake that could have ended her career had instead transformed it, creating ripples of change throughout the community. Mitchell had become what Chuck had seen in her all along, not just an officer of the law, but a guardian of hope, showing others the same path from force to wisdom that she had walked herself.